Today I'm talking to Richard Boyd Barrett, who's a member of the Irish Parliament and a leading light in the No campaign on the referendum on the Fiscal Pact. Richard Boyd Barrett, thanks for talking to us. Tell us first what the Fiscal Pact is.
Well, the pact is a European agreement which countries are being asked to sign up to, which will compel governments to reduce debt and deficit figures by a certain amount per year over a long period of time. And what we're concerned about is that in effect, because of all the gambling debts of banks and speculators have been put onto the books of the state, that this will mean permanent austerity, billions worth of cuts every year for at least a decade or more in order to meet the treaty targets. And that, we believe, will do untold damage to the economy, which is already very traumatized, and impose even more suffering on working people, on the less well off, on the vulnerable in our society, who have already been devastated by 4 years of austerity.
And talk to me more about that. What's the socio-economic backdrop against which this referendum's being held?
Well, in Ireland now we have 450,000 people unemployed. We've had 200,000 people leave the country because there is no work. We've got approximately 750,000 people living in poverty, about 250,000 children living in poverty, literally going to bed hungry at night. We have public services that have been utterly devastated by austerity cuts imposed by the EU IMF over the last 4 years. So really, people cannot take much more pain, and equally this has not done anything to help the economy recover. The economy has tipped back into recession, and I think if you look at the rest of Europe, it's clear the austerity policies have also driven the wider Eurozone into recession. So we think we have to call a halt to this policy, which is simply not working and which is doing extreme damage, if you like, to the social and economic fabric of Europe.
And what's the atmosphere like here? We hear from the Greeks that this constant pushing for more and more austerity from the government is creating this kind of atmosphere of fear in the country. Is it the same here?
Yes, I think the government's main weapon in trying to get people to vote yes has been fear, threats that money won't come out of the ATMs, that there'll be no money to pay pensions and social welfare. So there's no positive reasons being given. It's just you've got to take this austerity, otherwise there will be disaster. And in fact, we think the disaster is happening already. It's clear Greece have been, if you like, the major victims of austerity, and now they're proposing to generalise that austerity model right across Europe. And if it didn't work in Greece, what makes them think it's going to work in the rest of Europe?
And what's at stake here? What would accepting and declining the pact actually mean for the Irish people?
Well, I think if we accept, we're essentially giving the government a mandate to impose austerity for the next 10 or 15 years. If we vote no, I think we will be aligning ourselves with the growing movement in Europe that we've seen with the French elections, with the Greek elections recently, with the big protest movements developing in Spain and Portugal, and even in Germany itself, where the opposition are refusing to ratify this treaty. I think we will be aligning ourselves with those forces who are saying austerity hasn't worked, and that we need to focus on jobs, investment, financial stimulus and economic growth, rather than the failed and discredited policy of austerity.
How financially integrated is Ireland into Europe? We're talking bank loans and bailouts, that kind of thing.
Oh, we're very deeply intertwined. Europe are our biggest trading partners, so there's no doubt that our fate is linked to the wider European economy. But I think there is a battle going on in Europe as to whether we follow the Merkel-Sarkozy model of austerity and bailing out banks, or whether we go in a different direction where we prioritise employment, the protection of public services, and economic growth. And we're certainly for the latter.
You seem so sure that the EU won't cut off funding to Ireland, even if the vote does go against measures proposed by Brussels. What makes you so sure?
Well, I think there's an implication that Europe bails countries out. In fact, what they're doing is bailing out the European financial system. That's the reason they're providing assistance. And if they perceive a threat to the European banks, to German, French and British banks, they will provide funding, because otherwise the entire Eurozone will collapse. So we think it's a bogus threat to suggest that if we vote no, they're going to cut off funding, because they would be cutting off their nose to spite their face.
Almost every major political party in Ireland is in the yes camp, and this treaty's already been ratified by all but 2 European countries. Can so many political and economic minds be wrong?
Well, that's not strictly true. Governments have signed up have agreed to ratify the treaty, but in fact many of those governments are now finding themselves unable to actually get the treaty through their parliaments. So the Dutch government have been unable to get it through their parliament. Francois Hollande is delaying the ratification precisely because he believes on its own it will do more damage to the French economy, and now Angela Merkel cannot even get the fiscal treaty, which she wrote effectively, through the German parliament because the German opposition are saying it will mean more cuts and do damage to the German economy. So I think there's a real question mark over whether this treaty can be pushed through, and we want to add our weight to the forces in Europe that are saying more austerity won't work and that we need a different approach.
The Yes camp says if the fiscal pact isn't ratified, Irish people would be subject to harsher austerity for longer, it will be more expensive to borrow money on the international markets, and there would be no more EU bailouts. Surely all of those are situations that you would want to avoid?
No, I don't believe. First of all, it would be difficult for the austerity to be any worse than it has been over the last 4 years. We've had 24 billion euro sucked out of the Irish economy with devastating consequences, and the fiscal treaty would require us to take more or less the same amount over the next number of years, which can only have the effect of more unemployment, more economic stagnation, more suffering for people. So we believe there is an alternative to that, and that is to focus instead on investment, jobs and growth, rather than the continuous policy of bailing out the bondholders and the banks that caused the crisis in the first place.
What about this idea of sovereignty? It seems that some of what is at stake here is this kind of emotional feeling of nationhood. Can Ireland afford to have that kind of pride at the moment?
Well, I'd like to put it more in terms of democracy, not just for Ireland but for Europe as a whole. And what the fiscal treaty will do will centralise more power over economic policy into the hands of the unelected European Union Commission and the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice, when really it should be democratically elected representatives, both at a national level and at a European level, who should dictate policy as the people decide. So we don't think we should tie ourselves into a treaty that will essentially enforce a particular economic policy or dogma on people in perpetuity.
How far is Ireland at the moment from a Greek situation?
I think if we continue down the road of austerity, we're about a year behind Greece in terms of the devastation that is likely to be caused to the economy in our society. So we think it is very, very urgent that we call a halt to that and demand that both our government and European leaders end the policy of bailing out banks and paying for it with brutal austerity being imposed on the people when that is doing such obvious and serious damage to the economy and its prospects for recovery.
Ireland still depends on EU financing and quarterly inspections to decide on each new tranche of money that's released. That won't stop regardless of the referendum result. What can be done to solve that?
Well, I mean, certainly I don't believe the EU IMF programme is working, and I don't believe it's a bailout for the Irish people. As I said, I think it really is a bailout for the French, British, European banks, the people who engaged in the reckless speculation that has destroyed the European economy and done extreme damage to our economy. So I think we have to strike out in a different path where we instead put the resources directly into infrastructural projects, into enterprise, into employment measures that can get people back to work and restart the European economy, get it out of the extreme stagnation that is now suffocating the entire Eurozone.
Richard Boyd Barrett, thank you very much.